Welcome to our Renaissance Lives. Thank you for tuning in. Today's session is dedicated to the life of Hans Holbein the Younger through Jeanne Nuechterlein's book, Holbein the Artist in a Changing World, a topic which I assume is relevant to the present insofar as the past 50 or so years have witnessed changes that previously took place at a much slower pace over several centuries. Now, the first half of the 16th century, which is the time during which Holbein lived, he lived between 1497 and 1543. This first half of the 16th century is also a period of dramatic changes in terms of religion, of civil thought, of science, of politics, and even in terms of artistic supplies, materials, and techniques. Now, changes through various challenges and opportunities at humans. And as you will see today, of the various possibilities that change throughout us, Holbein seems to have adapted and adopted the most advantageous for his business. Now, to explore this in further detail, I am joined by the author, Jeanne Nuechterlein, who is professor at the Department of History of Art of the University of York and author of monograph studies on Northern Renaissance art and its reception. And I am equally joined by Alexander Marr, Professor of Renaissance and Early Modern Art at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Trinity Hall. He's the author of the volume on Rubens. He has worked on the concept of wit through many volumes and articles, and at the moment he's preparing a book on Holbein's wit, and to whom I'm passing you the microphone. It's all yours, Alex.
Thank you, Francois. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening to talk about Jeanne Nuechterlein's brilliant book on Hans Holbein, the artist in a changing world. My copy of which I have here. I don't know if you can see it or me, but I'm holding it up, and it's got many post-it notes throughout. It's a really fantastic book in an equally fantastic series. Some of you may know Jeanne's earlier work, the monograph Translating Nature into Art, Holbein, the Reformation and Renaissance Rhetoric, which was a landmark study in the field that examined Holbein in relation to certain literary topoi, particularly rhetoric as practiced by Erasmus and his circle, and offered us a new take on Holbein's relationship to mimesis. Now that study was a thoroughly scholarly one. It was aimed, I think, primarily at an academic audience. The Renaissance Live series has a slightly different remit, examining key individuals in their time and in the context of the wider culture, and in a shorter and more accessible format. So, Jeanne, I wanted to begin by asking you, as somebody who had already written a very impactful scholarly monograph on Holbein, what did you consider to be the opportunities and also the challenges of writing about him in this different format?
Yes, thank you. And I also just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to write the book in the first place, and then also to do this podcast. So my first book on Holbein came partly out of my dissertation, which was about Holbein and the Reformation, and then partly out of a new set of work that I began doing, particularly around 2005, 2006. About rhetoric and about different ways of writing and conceiving a topic, and then trying to think about how that might intersect with the ways that Holbein varied his representational style. So as you said, that was a very scholarly book, very much aimed at an academic audience. And what excited me about the idea of contributing to the Renaissance Live series is the opportunity to write a book which is still very much grounded in research, in original interpretation, but where you can actually be a little bit more free, I think, in terms of the writing style, and suggesting, putting ideas out there, but not necessarily feeling like you have to write for like 10 pages, in order to support every little point that's being made, but just kind of give an indication of the wealth of ideas. And I think writing to a wider audience, thinking about what is it about Holbein's art that's exciting, but also conveying that some sense of the kind of scholarly underpinning of that was really what I was thinking about.
Thanks. That's very great to know. Now, an artist like Holbein, in stark contrast to the artist I wrote about for this series, Rubens, is somebody who has left a really minimal trace in the written record.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's quite a challenge for biographers because we have so little documentary evidence to go on. We have no correspondence. We have barely anything in his own hand. Really, only
Hmm.
a couple of annotations on drawings. We have a kind of small amount of contractual information. We have a handful of reports from some of his contemporaries. But in terms of writing a life, he's not the most amenable subject.
No, absolutely. And I think you can kind of see in the structure of the chapters that I wrote, there's a very, very broadly chronological ordering to some of the themes. And yet, it really has to be about the themes themselves and about the artworks rather than giving a sense of him himself. Now, I have to admit that for me, I think actually part of the reason why I love Holbein is precisely because we don't have a huge amount of contextual data that tells us exactly what sort of a person he was. And it means that you really need to spend that time analyzing the art itself and trying to understand what it seems to want to communicate. But I do often feel like a lot of times what we learn about is not just kind of Holbein's own interpretation, but the ways in which he's creating something that he knows that his patrons want to buy. Essentially, I think he's really an artist that is thinking about how can I maintain my professional life here? Who's going to buy my work? And I think that's part of why he moves around so much and works with such different people. So there's always a bit of a mystery as to kind of what he himself thinks about what he's portraying versus what he thinks somebody else wants.
I think that's very true. And before we move on to the thematic chapters, which are, I think, set out for everyone here in the contents page of your book, I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit about Holbein in the public imagination. Um, because in a way, it seems to me that we have two Holbeins for two geographies.
Mm.
We have the Holbein in the English or British imagination, which is the artist of the Tudor court, the creator of Henry VIII's image, and at least in Hilary Mantel's fictional telling, a bit of a sort of buffoon who is only interested in the main chance and
Mm.
and the finances. And then we have the Holbein of the German-speaking public imagination, who is a very different artist, an artist of intellect and of humanism, and indeed of religion, of devotional painting, as much, if not more than of portraiture. And
Mm.
I just wondered how you kind of what your thoughts are about these two different Holbeins, whether that was something that was in the back of your mind as you were tackling this subject, whether you wanted to integrate the two, kind of whether you wanted to challenge popular perceptions of Holbein, and how that informed your thinking about the kind of rationale for the book.
Mm. I think you're absolutely right that there is an English-speaking perception of Holbein, which is very, very tightly related to the portraiture at the English court, and really sees him very much in that context. Now, I have to imagine I'm quite sure he wasn't a buffoon. I'm sure he was an extremely canny person who knew how to interact with people in order to get what he wanted and needed professionally. But I have to admit that my own interest in him actually really did start not so much with that later work, but really with the earlier work, and particularly thinking about the Reformation context and about the intellectual challenges that those religious changes brought about, and how he, as an artist who was just coming to maturity at the moment that the Reformation was erupting, that, you know, this would have accompanied him as he's trying to develop his career. And so he would have had to think very, very carefully. I mean, not just purely in kind of professional terms, but intellectually about the status of what he was doing and how it related to the religious currents of the time as well as the intellectual currents of the time. And you can see from his very, very earliest works that he's starting to engage with the writings of Erasmus and other humanist literature, as you say, and kind of seeing that clearly as an opportunity for him to move forward. So yeah, I definitely wanted in this book to give a very strong sense of the whole range of his career. And so I very deliberately, in a sense, kind of put the portraiture at the end. I mean, both because it kind of makes sense to, you know, to think about it chronologically in terms of it dominating that later part of the career, but to really give that sense of the range of other kinds of things that he was doing throughout. So that portraiture then becomes one aspect of his thinking about art making. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I really admire about the book, is that we get a sense of the entirety of the oeuvre, that it's very evenly balanced between these different domains in which Holbein is active, in terms both of genre, devotional painting, portraiture, but also design work. And I think we're going to come on to that maybe towards the end of today's conversation. But we also get a sense of the different mediums in which Holbein is operating, because again, you know, maybe English-speaking audiences will know him primarily as a portraitist in oil, and of course also from his portrait drawings, many of which are in the Royal Collection and wonderfully on display, I think still just at the moment in the Queen's Gallery in Buckingham Palace, in an exhibition curated by Kate Hurd. And yeah, in your book, you really kind of, I think, try to give equal weight to the mediums in which he's operating, including print, of course. And I was really struck when I first picked up the book that was your entry point. That after the obligatory introduction and some scene setting, the first chapter is titled Techniques, Materials, and Skill. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, including your decision in that chapter to really put Holbein the Younger in relationship, both kind of artistic and familial, to his father, Hans the Elder, an important artist in his own right, also a pioneering portraitist in silver point. And I think it's maybe just worth mentioning that Hans the Elder has been the subject, or at least half the subject, of a major exhibition in Frankfurt at the Städel. So I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so by starting with technique, so when I was designing this, I thought about the range of topics that I wanted to cover, but also how to make a sort of broadly chronological sequence make sense. And it actually made sense in that respect to start with technique because of the fact that very, very early in his work, we can see the things that he is taking from his father, and very clearly, particularly the use of silver point. So actually in this detail that we're showing here, the top and the bottom hands are outlined in silver point and have various detailing in silver point, but then are highlighted with a medium that his father did not use so much, this chalk. And then we have this very, very quick, much quicker black chalk drawing in the center, which partly just kind of demonstrates the ways in which he has learned certain ideas from his father, who really used drawings, sketches as a means of capturing ideas that he would then later put into his paintings of various kinds. And yet he was really developing throughout his work different ways of using materials, and very quickly, I think, actually moved beyond some of the ways that that his father worked. And one other really significant thing I want to point out in relation to this, so we've put one of his very, very rare surviving sketches that was a preliminary study related to a finished portrait next to the Erasmus portrait, where you can see the studies of the hand. And this is something where we know that Holbein must have done lots of this kind of thing, and yet almost none of them survive. And so this is a really rare opportunity where we can see actually two slightly different styles of drawings that he does. So you have the hands that, especially the one that ends up being the finished left hand, which is fairly carefully done and carefully modeled. And then you have a much quicker sketch of a hand kind of more in motion, as if he's trying to capture that sense of the action of drawing, which I don't think you get quite as much sense of that from the work of his father, actually. And in that case, there's another Erasmus portrait, which shows a writing hand in a slightly different orientation. But you get the sense of, from this very small glimpse of this very rare survival, of the kind of process that he must have done, where he was taking ideas from observation and then putting them together into these final paintings. But we very rarely have the surviving evidence of that process. In most cases, we only have the final picture. So it's really exciting in this particular case to have that preliminary work here.
And of course, this is such a thrilling juxtaposition. The preliminary drawing of Erasmus's hands, including his writing hand, which is obviously not present in the Longford picture on loan to the National Gallery, but is in the other version of Erasmus that Holbein paints, which is Erasmus writing, and then the man himself, because this is a remarkable encounter between two artists of different mediums, but
Yes.
both artists of the stylus, both artists, as it were, of the pen. One for writing, one for drawing, and this is an incredible encounter, really, an instantiation, kind of momentary instantiation of that competition between painting and poetry, of which Erasmus was one of the most vocal supporters of the superiority of the literary arts, and he's very denigrating about the limitations of the visual arts. I just wondered if you'd like to say a little bit about that in connection to your emphasis in that first chapter on techniques and skill in the medium, and maybe how Holbein silently but eloquently offers a rejoinder to Erasmus's kind of rather smug critique of the visual arts, which I've always felt this particular painting exudes.
Absolutely. Well, I do think that Erasmus is someone who at a kind of deep level just doesn't really get art in a certain level, and the power, the intellectual power that you can actually have through an image, I don't think he really kind of fully appreciated. And I just would love to be able to go back in time and sit in on these conversations and try to imagine what the dialogue between them might have been. And I imagine that what Holbein has a very clear, strong sense of is the ways in which you can look at something, manipulate it, capture it, and present an image which communicates in a very complex way something about the being of the person who is represented. Whereas Erasmus, he sort of feels as if external appearance don't actually tell you anything. It's the writing that reveals something. And I don't think he really appreciated the ways in which the combination of elements in this portrait in particular, the fact that you've got the sitter there, but you have the book, you have the pilaster with the siren, you have the inscription there referring to the works of Hercules. You have this very strange perspective with this shelf in the back and the books and the inscription referring to Holbein's own skill. And the whole space of this painting also doesn't make any sense. And so therefore it immediately, at least if you're thinking about it, announces itself as an image which isn't just simply capturing appearance, but is constructing an image made out of different elements in order to reveal something about Erasmus. But I do think that exactly what it reveals about Erasmus is very open to interpretation. And when you read a lot of the literature about this work, what they think it reveals about Erasmus is often very contradictory, conflicting, divergent. And in a way, I kind of feel like that's what Holbein was trying to give a sense of an image that actually has quite a lot of complexity within it.
I think that's very well said. And just sort of sticking with the theme of your first chapter, sort of materials and stuff. we often think of Holbein maybe as an artist of the surface, of external appearance. And of course, he's extraordinarily adept at feigning the difference between different materials. But could you say a little bit more about his investment actually in matter, in the stuff that goes into the clothes Erasmus wears, the leather cover of the book that he holds, the artist's own pigments that he or an assistant was mixing? How does he relate to materials? And I ask this in part because one of the things that we've seen over the past 20 years or so in our field has been the material turn, the material imaginary, and I wonder what that sort of shift offers to us in relation to how we understand Holbein as an artist.
I think that we see in his work a very strong interest in being able to give you a sense of the materiality of the different kinds of textures and surfaces and objects that he's representing. And you see that extremely well in the representation of the fur, the interior of the fur sleeves that you see here, which is then contrasted with the leather surface of the book, the other kind of aspects of his clothing, the edge of the book with this inscription, where you can really kind of see that sense of the gilded edges there, contrasting then also with the ribbon of the cloth. And this is something that many people have argued that that very, very early in his career, in his earliest paintings, Holbein hadn't yet really mastered an ability to capture that sense of surfaces. You also see that particularly in the glass carafe, and that sense of the light kind of shining through it and casting the shadow and having that sense of the refraction of the glass and the way that the light hits the surface in part and passes through it in part. And so he's really thinking about these different materials and demonstrating a capacity to render them. Although I do think that the way that he achieves that is often actually relatively, I mean, I'm not so much an expert really in all of these the kind of use of materials to create an effect. But my sense is that he often actually represents these things relatively quickly and economically. So it looks as if he's kind of slaving over details. And yet I think that he knew how to actually achieve certain effects with a relative economy of means. And I think that's also true of this work as well. So for instance, if you think about the way that he paints that carafe and compare it with, say, an Ikean painting, well, Van Eyck himself also is able to achieve things with a certain economy, but it's not actually quite the same painterly technique that he uses.
That's so interesting. And in the Frankfurt exhibition, for those of you that have seen it, there's an interesting juxtaposition between Holbein the Younger and Van Eyck, the Lucca Madonna. Our colleague Jochen Sander has proposed that it's really Holbein's encounter with Van Eyck or Ikean painting that leads to this development in his art. So that's something that we're still talking about. So in terms of sort of thinking about kind of materials and techniques, this is perhaps a moment for us to move on. Thank you, Francois, to one of the other mediums in which Holbein is active. But as a designer rather than necessarily a crafter, and that is his designs for woodblock images, for primarily the printing houses of Basel, the Froben firm, especially, with which he's associated in his earlier years, then later on to a lesser extent with some of the printers of London, where we have here some. We're talking about economy in an incredibly small scale. I mean, these things are really, really tiny, and you can maybe tell us a little bit more about that. It's something you bring out really beautifully in the second chapter of the book. Holbein is offering us almost sort of whole narratives, or sort of certainly suggesting narratives in the kind of smallest of spaces.
Yeah, so when you look at his portraits, so a lot of the works that we're going to be looking at today, there's a certain kind of stasis about them, a kind of sense of them being, very stationary and figures that are standing in a kind of unmoving pose and a kind of captured pose. And what those very tiny images do in a sort of paradoxical way is that they really give you much more of a sense of movement, of dynamism, of action and behavior. And it's kind of paradoxical that he's doing that, on these things that are literally a couple of centimeters large. And one of the things that also really interests me about this work, which I think is sometimes sometimes difficult to integrate with the rest of his production, is that we know that he's designing these, but of course we don't actually see the designs themselves. We see the final outcome, and the quality of the final outcome depends just as much on the skill of the person who's actually cutting the design, either into a metal plate or into a wood block. And so we then see these very interesting variations in terms of how effective these images appear to be, quite how persuasive the physiognomies are, for example. And you see that very clearly in the top letters, which I very deliberately wanted to juxtapose. This is one of his very earliest alphabet designs. And again, we don't know exactly what the design was, but the one that's on the left probably gives you a better sense of what his original design was, although not brilliantly, I think, executed by whoever it was who was cutting it. And then on the right, you can then see there's someone else who was then seeing that letter, wanted to imitate it, and really made it much worse, frankly. And so when you're looking at these images, you have to both think about what is it that Holbein himself was trying to design, probably using pen, I would imagine, to get a sense of the lines here. But then also trying to discern in what ways might it have been interpreted or reinterpreted by the cutter that might change what the impression is.
So could you give us a sense of the milieu in which Holbein is operating in Basel when he's producing these designs, which might not be sort of familiar to everyone in the audience? So he's moved to Basel from Augsburg, where he trained with his father. This is a thriving mercantile town. It's home to many printers. It's home to a university. Erasmus is there for a period of time working with the Froben Press, which is producing extremely elegant books, informed in part by the example of Aldus Manutius in Venice, the subject, by the way, of another Renaissance Lives study. Very, very good book. So yeah, could you just sort of set the scene for us?
Yep. So Basel was one of the most important centers for humanist publishing at this time. So there's a huge number of works being published in Latin, but also in Greek, as well as in Hebrew, a mixture of patristic, biblical works from the ancient period, but then also secular works of philosophy, of creative writing, of all kinds of topics, and as well as contemporary humanist writers. So it's very intellectual. It's mostly being published in Latin specifically, so only aimed at a very specific audience. And most of these, certainly of the examples that I'm giving here, the great majority of these were designed to be published in these Latin or occasionally Greek publications. And they're designed to give a sense. They very rarely give a kind of literal representation that's related to the specific subject matter. Every once in a while, there is something where you can perceive a link. But I think what normally happened was that the publisher asked Holbein, "Can you create an alphabet series with various figures of animals in the background? Can you do a series with various foliage design? Can you do a series with various images representing putti in various sorts of actions?" And then he would create these letters, which could then be used for all kinds of publications. So they could be kind of taken in and out and used for kind of years to come. It's particularly kind of at the opening of a significant new section of text where you want to highlight, that here's a kind of a new subsection that these letters would appear. And so most of these works appear in actually several different publications over time. And as I said earlier, I think that this aspect of his work is sometimes difficult to appreciate, especially because they are literally these tiny little images, in these kind of published books that you have to flip through the pages to really see the wealth of what he's producing. So this would have been seen by, a kind of a specific kind of audience that would be reading these very erudite publications.
And that leads on nicely to a question about sorry, Francois, if you could still stick with the woodcuts for a minute. A question about the title of your second chapter, Education, Knowledge. Holbein's producing these designs for Latin and some Greek books. Could you say a little bit about his education? I think we agree that he's certainly no buffoon. He's a highly intelligent artist, but not necessarily a classically educated one. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about, what these designs tell us about that, or what they conceal.
Yes. So I'm fairly certain that he would not have had, that kind of education. He would not have known Latin particularly well. There's no evidence that he did. And I suspect this is probably one of the reasons why you sometimes sense that there's a bit of a barrier between him and Erasmus and truly seeing eye to eye, because I don't think that Holbein had the knowledge of the use of language, specifically in Latin, that Erasmus had. But what he did have, I think, was an understanding of the ways that the ideas themselves or the concepts that they conveyed could then be turned into images that conveyed a kind of analogous wit or learning or complexity of ideas or etc. So it's like he achieves in visual form what Erasmus achieves in written form.
I really love that idea, and I think these are a perfect example. I mean, Erasmus and Moore show off their virtuosity and their learning in a particular kind of form, the epigram. You talked about economy. The epigram is the most economical, literary form. The idea is that you offer something extremely capacious in a kind of very sort of short format. Do you think Holbein is doing something similar in these designs? If so, to what extent do you think it's a conscious dialogue with the humanist
Yeah.
topics?
Oh, that is such a difficult question, I think, to engage with, because there are sometimes ways, for instance, when he does his marginal drawings in the Praise of Folly, there are moments where you can see that he's responding to something that comes up in the text, and he kind of riffs on it in his own way and sort of goes off in his own direction. When it comes to these little kind of tiny images, can we go back to the so in these, I think that and you can kind of get a sense of evolution, I think, also over the course of the work that he's doing. One of the things I think he gets better and better at is constructing an image that really gives you a very powerful kind of complete sense of a little kind of narrative scene, a little kind of something which is going on, which is a little bit, it's kind of not quite as compactly expressed, I think, in the early works. I mean, I do think I suggested, and I suspect this is kind of the case, that when you look at the three putti in the initial queue, it seemed to me very striking that their faces are all kind of covered up. And it seems to me that he's doing that very deliberately. So he is kind of making designs, I think, where he's kind of playing around with ideas. But I think that when you get to the later ones, there's just I think he's much more effective in the ways in which he can communicate a little scene. For instance, with this that amazing delta image there is just such a kind of powerful composition and so expressive of this contrast between the two figures. So it's maybe a kind of like visual equivalent to that idea, the kind of very brief, perfectly encapsulated literary production.
Thank you, Francois. If we could, great, we're zooming out. Thank you. No, just sorry. Stick with the woodcuts. We've got more to say about them, and I agree with Jeanne that they're a really underappreciated aspect of his oeuvre. So I think it's important that we give them sort of full reign here. I wonder, just the last thing I wanted to ask about these is if you could say something about Holbein and visual humor. Again, if we think about Erasmus and the epigram and more, they're making fart jokes, they're laughing at people with big noses. There's quite a lot of physical humor, which again we might not associate with these very, very erudite humanists. And again, maybe we might not associate Holbein with physical humor. If we think about his later portraiture, you're not going to laugh at the image of Henry VIII in the Whitehall mural, or if you did, you'd have your head on the block.
Mm-hmm.
But some of these are quite funny.
Yes, absolutely. The kind of interaction between the figures, I think, are very clearly designed to elicit that sense of entertainment. And I do think that for him, that Holbein had a sense of propriety about what was appropriate for different kinds of images. So in his portraits, he is being very kind of staid, and maybe they're witty, but they're not usually humorous in the way that I think a lot of these images most certainly are. And I think the ways in which the body expresses emotion and ideas is something that he does in these types of images, which is very, very different from the way that he portrays human figures elsewhere. Can I just say one final thing before we move on? I want to just publicly acknowledge that I say something in my book about that delta, which is actually completely wrong. I said that the inner triangle is equilateral, whereas the outer triangle is essentially isosceles, which actually makes no sense. I don't even know why I said that. They're both isosceles triangles, but I kind of just wanted to publicly say I got something wrong when I was describing the forms here.
Or even Homer nods. Now, something that was supposedly no laughing, something that was supposedly no laughing matter in Holbein's era was religion, although Erasmus and the Praise of Folly might lead us to think otherwise. But certainly when we look at something like the Solothurn Madonna, this we're moving into something quite different. We're moving into the realm of faith, and in particular during Holbein's lifetime, contested varieties of Christian faith. And your third chapter is religion, Reformation, politics. Three really huge things to cover in quite a small number of pages. So when you came to write this chapter, and I don't know how you did it. I mean, when you came to write this chapter, you know, what was your motivation? What did you want to convey as the essential things that anyone coming to your book should take away from Holbein's connection to these massive themes? In an era of huge change. I mean, this is what changes the most in his life.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Well, it was really helpful for writing that chapter that I had already written my PhD thesis specifically on Holbein and the Reformation, and then the book that had come out of that. I don't think it would have been possible to write that chapter in the same way without having done that research. So my take on Holbein, particularly in the works that he's doing right around this time period, around 1521, 1522, is that he's at this moment, he has grown up watching his father make these absolutely massive, extremely important, grand altarpieces for monastic institutions. And this is one of the major genres of art making of the previous era. And he is now in a culture, a time when that was coming under question, and there is much less opportunity to create religious works in a place where the critiques of Martin Luther and other reformers are calling into question the possibility of religious images. And I think that there's a couple of paintings, this is in a way almost the very best exemplar of it, where I think he's trying to find a sort of middle ground, trying to acknowledge the critiques of the reformers while still painting an image that would actually serve a religious purpose. So in this image, it uses very traditional iconography in a certain sense, the idea of the Virgin and Child seated with this kind of sense of a kind of halo behind her in this very kind of stripped back architectural setting, flanked by two saints. And this is made kind of either as an altarpiece or as a devotional image. And it was made probably in donation for a church. So it serves this religious purpose. And yet at the same time, it seems to me that it's deflecting a sense of worship by focusing so much on a kind of naturalistic representation of the figures, and in particular by making the Virgin and Child look so much like ordinary people. And it seems to me that a lot of what is happening in a painting like this is that Holbein is thinking about, well, if we still believe in religious images having a purpose, having a role, what could that be within this this kind of very problematic era we're in? And I think that is the most amazing Christ child ever painted in a way. I mean, it looks so much like a genuine kind of slightly squirming baby, who's kind of, lifting up a hand in what almost then becomes a kind of proto-blessing gesture, but not in that very kind of self-conscious way, that you see in images. And he really looks like a human infant, even at the same time as within the overall composition, you really kind of appreciate the significance of who he is and what the significance of the overall image is. And yet this is something that he tried for a couple of years, but I think the market just disappeared. There just weren't people who were prepared to commission this kind of work. So it's a kind of encapsulation of the fact that he grew up in a certain kind of religious climate that was then changing. And then as the market for that kind of fell through, he really then had to turn much more towards other kinds of genres for the rest of his career.
I think that's so fascinating that you see this work as Holbein somehow compromising, maybe slightly distancing himself from some of those controversies. And one of the ways that he does that is through naturalism. I think that's a really, really interesting insight. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about Holbein and his relationship to Christian faith, because one of the few things that we know about him is that when the Reformation comes to Basel and there's a change in the way that church services are conducted, particularly around the Mass, Holbein is listed in the register as one of the people who has not conformed to the new kind of service. And he's obviously hauled up in front of the regulatory bodies and asked why not, and he says, well, I need it to be understood to me. I need to be explained to me better. I need to understand it better. And then after that, his name comes off the register, so he presumably conforms himself. And one of the things, if I could go back in time and have a conversation with Holbein, the first thing I'd ask him is, how do you really feel about Erasmus? And the second thing I'd ask him is, well, what do you really believe, or what do you think you believe? What do you, as someone who's lived with Holbein for so long, what do you think he thought he believed?
In one sense, I would say I have absolutely no idea. The one thing that I think we can definitely say about him is that he wasn't a zealot either way. He was someone who was willing to accommodate both a kind of Catholic sensibility in some of the early works that he does, and a Reformation sensibility in some of the other works that he does. And when he's given certain commissions in England that combine a sense of, the role of the church and the state and how they're combined, he's willing to do that. So what he actually thinks is very difficult to discern, but whatever it is that he felt, I think that he was willing to do what needed to be done, pretty much. And so therefore, I think he can't possibly have a very extremely strong conviction one way or the other. But I think we'll never know for sure.
I'm sure that's right. And Francois has neatly kind of moved us on to one of those other great works that is grappling with some of those changes in the Renaissance world, the Ambassadors, which is about many different things, but one thing we're pretty sure it's about is how the Reformation has impacted Christendom and what might be the way to salvation. Your fourth chapter is actually called Science, Observation, Manipulation. And so while this work is to some extent about religion and Reformation and politics, it's obviously also about science and observation and manipulation, not least with the famous anamorphic skull in the foreground. Now, am I right that you first thought that you were going to write a book about Holbein and science?
Yes. Yeah. So when I was initially approached to come up with a proposal for this series, I was thinking about, well, what aspect of Holbein do I feel like I haven't really addressed before that I think there might be kind of scope for more to do? And I thought science. And I actually wrote an entire draft of that book. But the problem was that it very quickly turned into a kind of separate research monograph. So that has now turned into a separate project, which I'm hoping to finally complete the final version of that. That's later this year. But it comes out of the work that I was doing, thinking about his representation really of scientific objects, as well as other kinds of subjects that relate to the expanding sense of knowledge in the world. And with this particular painting, what struck me the more that I looked at it was that virtually everything that's represented on these shelves, the objects in the shelves, are actually not correctly represented. If you know what these instruments are supposed to look like, how they're supposed to operate, there's something profoundly wrong with them. And it kind of gets worse as you move upwards to that upper shelf to astronomy. And this really got me thinking about that relationship between observation, what he does when he looks at something in the world in order to insert it into a painting, and gave me a sense that he is always thinking about, how can I actually change this? How can I manipulate it? How can I make it look kind of persuasive in a superficial way? And yet I'm actually kind of playing with it to create the effect that I want. And I think that by being able to define that fairly carefully with some of these objects, particularly with these two books that are shown on the lower shelf, because as previous researchers have demonstrated, these are imitations fairly closely of existing text. The one on the left, an arithmetic book, he has reproduced that page virtually exactly. And then with the hymnal on the right, he has reproduced most of it, but then inserted certain changes and manipulations. And that gave me an example of, we can actually look at the thing that he looked at in order to create these images and sort of track really precisely how it is that he has changed them. And that sort of gave me into a way to thinking more broadly about how he's doing that within the other kinds of objects that are depicted here.
So in this particular painting, Holbein has obviously sort of fully mastered various different perspectival techniques, even if he's applying them not for precise imitation, but for a manipulated, slightly skewed reality, which I think is a very interesting aspect of his practice. It's always struck me that what he does here with perspective is really quite different to what he does earlier on in his career, where if we look at something like his designs for the so-called House of the Dance, these amazing sort of trompe-l'oeil, facade murals in Basel, there's no precisely plotted perspective. It's really approximated. He's not at that stage. He's clearly not really interested in kind of mathematical precision, and yet here he's kind of fully embraced that, albeit employing it to his own peculiar purposes. And I wonder if you could say something about that. Is it a result of his encounter with Nicholas Kratzer, the mathematician, the royal astronomer, some of whose instruments we think are depicted in this painting? How should we understand Holbein and mathematics, particularly, in relation to an artist maybe like Albrecht Dürer, about whom I know you're also writing, who is very invested, at least in parts of his career, with mathematics, geometry, perspective in a sort of kind of fairly sort of scholarly and literary way. What do you think Holbein's relationship to that domain of the liberal arts is?
Well, I think his relation to mathematics remains very imprecise, actually, throughout his entire career. And the odd thing about this painting, and it took me a really long time of thinking about it and analyzing it and comparing it with his other works, I really think that what's happening here is that he must be collaborating with someone, most likely Kratzer, I think, who does have a really precise knowledge about these instruments and the way that they're supposed to work, who is then able to collaborate with Holbein in order to create manipulations that don't entirely make sense. But I don't think it's Holbein who's coming up with the ideas, the underlying ideas themselves, if that makes any sense. So just to give one brief example of that. So with the white objects that you can see there, a quadrant, which is kind of slightly hidden, partially hidden behind another object. There is something which is called a shadow square, where you see kind of the edge of it, kind of at the lower right, you see part of this shadow square. And it looks as if it's extremely precisely depicted. But if you get up really close to it, he's actually shown it wrong. So it's got the wrong number of degrees, and the diagonal line wouldn't end up in the correct place. So it would be completely useless as an instrument. And yet he's painted that really, really, really precisely. So it's not as if, I don't think he's just kind of randomly doing, oh, I'll do something that looks vaguely, like the object. It seems to me that it's wrong in a precise kind of way. But in order to have the knowledge of what was wrong about it, I think someone had to help him with that. So I think a work like this is a really sophisticated combination, actually, of different inputs, and then those ideas would have, of course, then related to the interests of the patron Jeanne Nuechterlein, who is working in this very, very complex political context, trying to really find and negotiate a way forward about the relationship between England and France in particular, and these other complexities of European politics and religion. And so I think having this painting that in a way kind of thematizes something that maybe seems perfect, exact on first glance, and yet the closer you look at it, the more that is revealed that isn't. And then, of course, is really emphasized by the anamorphic skull in the front. It's a very, very complex work that has a great deal of fascinating intellectual complexity to it.
And of course, one of the things that this work is unambiguously about is the patron. Jean de Dinteville, the French ambassador to the English court, and about his status and about courtly life. And that moves us sort of nicely on to your fifth chapter, which is called Patrons, Status, Court, which moves us into the domain that perhaps some people will be most familiar with, which is Holbein Courtier. There was a wonderful book written some years ago now by Mario Biagioli called Galileo Courtier, which reoriented our understanding of the pursuit of science in a court society, something that is maybe more familiar to art historians, where we expect artists to, at least successful ones, to be courtiers. And yet what we find with Holbein, at least in his early years in England, is that he's casting his net sort of fairly widely, isn't he? So yes, he's working for people like Thomas More, but he's also working for lesser gentry. He's maybe even working for some mercantile families. So could you say a little bit about that mix? It's not just the main power players, is it, that he's painting, at least early on?
Yeah, and I think actually I suspect kind of throughout this period, he might have been willing to paint a portrait for whoever was willing to pay him well for one. So in England, he moved to a very different type of social structure than he would have encountered in Basel. I mean, in London, of course, you can see an analogy with the city of Basel, but then the presence of the court, and particularly the very careful social hierarchy of the gentry all the way through to the dukes, to the king, that sense of the ways in which status might be visible on the body within a representation is something that I think he is having to think about in a different kind of way than he thought about with the kind of clientele that he would have encountered in Basel. So what we see in the portraits is in a way a kind of perfect melding of the ways in which he is able to present these images that on a certain surface level, as we've just been talking about in relation to the ambassadors, that look as if they are a very I don't know if neutral is the right word, but a very objective, descriptive representation of exactly what people looked like. And they convince you on a certain rhetorical level that they are a kind of naturalistic representation. And yet at the same time, as I argue in this chapter, that he's always thinking very, very carefully about how do I shape the pose, the clothing, something about the expression of the face, the context, in order to not just give you a sense as the kind of external marker of social identity, but to give you a sense of that this is kind of deeply intrinsic to this person. So we have here a really striking contrast on this slide between a woman whose identity we don't know in this relatively small panel, which is in Detroit, someone who, is clearly not an impoverished person, someone from maybe a kind of mercantile family. She's got fur, she's got one pearl, and so on. But she's clearly of a very, very different status than obviously the queen. And the contrast between them is partly about obviously the clothing that they're wearing, but it's equally these really subtle markers of the way that they're positioned, even though they are both positioned with the hands kind of being held in front of them. There's a kind of command which is conveyed by Jane Seymour, which is really lacking in the image of the woman who's in Detroit. And you get a very, very different sense of the kind of inner being of these people, expressed by a combination of external markers, but then also a sense that something about the body itself conveys who they are.
And of course, as you point out, this is in part conveyed not just by clothing, but also by accoutrements. In particular, in Holbein's work, often jewelry. And you mentioned
Yes.
the single pearl fastening the neck piece of the anonymous woman in the Detroit panel. But here we have Jane Seymour, who is standing remarkably erect for somebody who must have been weighed down
Yes, by all that.
by dozens and dozens and dozens of pearls, some freshwater pearls, some seed pearls, diamonds in the brooch here with black foil, the IHS jewel that Henry probably gifted her from one of his previous wives. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about Holbein and jewelry and goldsmithing, because he was not only a fantastic depictor of the jewels that individuals owned, but he was also a designer of those very things himself. And maybe just looking at time, maybe that's where we might end up with Holbein, not as painter, not as replicator, but as inventor of material goods.
Yeah, so this is another aspect of his work for the court where the final products are mostly completely gone. But we do have these amazing drawings in various media, again, kind of showing his use of different materials in order to convey these different types of objects, where he is designing cups, he is designing belts, he is designing book covers, he is designing jewels. And in a lot of cases, we don't really know for certain how many of these were necessarily created into final works. Now, in the case of the Jane Seymour cup, there is plenty of textual evidence, documentary evidence, that suggests that this was an actual object, and this is a design on the way towards that being a complete final object. Whether the belt design, which is shown in the other image there, was that ever actually produced into an object? We don't know for sure. But I think that one of the things that Holbein is doing is that he's demonstrating not only can I portray you exactly, give a sense of what you look like, but he is also able to create appropriate objects that are suitable for people, particularly of an elevated social status. And he's working very closely, I think, with goldsmiths at this time, producing these designs, which are really giving a sense of his creativity and his ability to come up with new objects that are suitable for this context.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeanne. I'm conscious that we're now coming up to 6:30, so I think it's probably time to draw our conversation to a close and to hand over to Francois for comparing of the chat. Jeanne, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Yes, thank you both. It's time, in fact, to open to a question for the audience. You can use either the raise hand option, which should be somewhere on the right-hand side of your screen, or you can send me a question through the chat and I will read it to Jeanne and Alexander. In the meantime, while you're preparing your question, about the question of Holbein designer, since he has the ability not only to design jewels, but also to paint them, do we know whether sometimes he invents jewels and whether it's naturalism, which often plays on what your brain thinks is real, but actually doesn't work in reality? Does it also apply to his conception of jewels in his portraits?
I think absolutely, and I do think there are some cases, like Alex mentioned with Jane Seymour, where we can link a representation to a documented kind of set of objects. So I think in that case, he's probably representing objects that actually exist. But I think that in some of his works, his portraits, which are accompanied by jewels, it's not always very clear whether what he's represented is a real thing or his creation of something that could be a real thing. And I think we don't always know the answer to that, although I think it is very striking that you do get that sense that he's always adapting, like he's not going to show someone of the wrong status wearing a jewel that is inappropriate for them. But whether he's showing you a jewel that they actually owned or a jewel that is maybe slightly more beautiful than the things they actually owned, we can never know for sure.
Sure. It seems to work within the context of some sumptuary law. That is, if you're of a certain status, you can't have so much more than certain jewels. Okay.
Yeah.
I see a question to the chat. Yes, from Niam. Hi, hi, and thank you very much. How much was Holbein aware and influenced by the work of other German painters like Dürer and Cranach? I think you mentioned this briefly at the beginning.
Well, I actually have a sense that his style is really very different from a lot of other German artists of this time. So artists like Cranach, Altdorfer, Dürer, a lot of these other artists are developing a very, very distinctive personal style, a very expressive style. And they very often represent works where they're almost taking that, maybe I wouldn't say to an extreme, but you certainly see in the works, for instance, of Altdorfer or Cranach, a kind of stylization of representation. And Dürer to a certain extent. But I feel like Holbein is actually doing something quite different, where he's trying to, in a sense, more assimilate a sense of his own style with this appearance of being able to represent things as they are. And I think he's very often doing a very careful balance between that in a way which actually seems to me less German than other German artists of the time.
Okay, I'm trying to get back to the Virgin and Child. To me, he seems to take over from Van Eyck, from the Madonna of the Vanderpyle. I mean, he makes it very modern, but it seems very, very close in spirit within his own technique.
Yeah, I think that he is doing a really interesting balancing here of ideas from Italy and ideas from Northern, from art, and that kind of careful attention to objects and surfaces, and also something about the kind of lack of sophistication, perhaps we might say, about the ways in which these figures are represented. I think he is looking to some of those traditions, and he's not doing quite as much of the very personalized, as I said, kind of very, very expressive mode of representation that we see in some other artists of this time.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Alison. Is there any evidence of input from the clients regarding his portraits?
Yeah, so this is something where we just have to kind of infer what this process might have been. So one of the few cases where we do have an interim design is the Thomas More family portrait, where we do have this drawing which was made, which survives because it then was sent to Erasmus as a gift. And we don't actually have that here, I think, on these slides. But that's kind of one example where we can see an initial concept for a composition. And then when you look at the copies that survive of the painting, the final painting doesn't survive, but we have what seem to be very good copies of it. You can see various differences. And it seems highly likely. We also have inscriptions on the drawing that suggest that that Holbein was kind of sitting with probably Kratzer and Moore and looking at the composition together and thinking about what was going to happen with changes. And there's some notations that suggest changes that should be made. So you can imagine that this is something that might have happened quite frequently, where he would produce an initial design and show it to the patron. They would maybe then have a discussion about, you know, which details are we going to keep, which things are we going to alter. But there's so few cases where we have specific evidence of that. So we have to just kind of imagine it, really.
Can I jump in here and just mention that so obviously Jeanne's absolutely right. We do have fragmentary evidence for some of his sitters contributing the text that appears in his portrait. So we don't have the image here, but one of his very early portraits in Basel is of a law student and humanist called Bonifacius Amerbach, who has a Latin inscription, and we have several pages of Amerbach trying out different varieties of the Latin and the Greek that he wanted to be used for this inscription in his portrait. So it suggests, as Jeanne said in the conversation, that quite often Holbein's paintings seem to be collaborative endeavors of a to and fro between the artist and his patron in terms of the ideas that then end up in visual form.
Okay, thank you. I've enlarged this picture because it connects with the next question in the chat from Angana Moatra. So thank you for a wonderful and comprehensive talk. I couldn't help but notice what looks like a shadow looming behind Jane Seymour in her portrait, which is something I don't recall seeing in the other Holbein portraits. Could you say something about this shadow that we can see on the...
Yeah, he does have a couple of examples of portraits like this with shadows. So so Christine of Denmark also has a shadow in the background. But this is something that he varied, but from one portrait to the next, exactly what that background is. So some of them are very kind of blank and flat. Probably a majority of them are flatter than that. But then he every once in a while has something like this where there's a vague suggestion of a space. Or there's some other examples where there's a kind of things in the foreground that suggest a kind of space receding behind them. And I think in this particular case, I wonder whether part of the reason he might be doing that is because compared with his other portraits, this one has a more sense of stylization, I think, just a slightly greater sense of turning this representation of this amazing clothing that she's wearing into a slightly abstracted representation. And there's also something a little bit kind of wooden in a certain way about her facial representation as well. So I wonder whether maybe in order to counteract that sense of abstraction, perhaps he's added the shadow in order to then shift us back a little bit more towards saying, oh, but yes, this is actually a real human being. And I think he makes those decisions differently for every single portrait that he does.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't see any more question in the chat, so it might just be the right moment to thank you both, Jeanne and Alex, for making time pass very quickly. Before I stop, there's another question in the chat. So thank you so much once more. I was wondering, in some of his portraits, I've shown that details such as flowers or plants are not underdrawn, but seems to have been applied at a later stage and more freely in a way. I guess that could not have been the case for other accessories in his portrait, in particular for the intricate instrument. So it's a question of what is added at the end, what is part of the composition.
Yeah, and actually there's going to be published relatively soon the catalog of German paintings at the National Gallery by Susan Foister, and she's going to be including in that some infrared images, actually of the ambassadors, where there does seem to be evidence that he kind of briefly sketched in kind of the locations of some of the instruments and then kind of worked them out more fully in painting. And I think this is something that he probably did quite frequently, where he was getting a sense of what the overall composition would be, but then would refine that and change it. And that might include actually adding something that hadn't been there before. And I suspect that in a lot of cases, he's doing that sometimes for very, I expect, kind of subtle aesthetic reasons in terms of what seems to look right and to work well as perhaps in certain cases, adding something of iconographical significance.
Okay, thank you. Another question, this time from Kathleen Hartman. Can you please explain Jane Seymour's necklace and brooch? It seems like the portrait has been digitally altered.
I'm not quite sure what is meant by that. I mean, I think that it is designed so that part of it does kind of go underneath the bodice that she's wearing, so that there's a kind of overlapping area there. So you can maybe just get a little bit of a sense of the kind of little bit of transparency that you get in that kind of top edge of a kind of like lace, and then it kind of disappears underneath the work there. So I'm not sure if that's quite is what is being referred to as looking digitally manipulated, or if it's something else about it. But well, while we're kind of mentioning that, one of the things I do think is very striking about the way that he represents objects is that he tends to, you see this underneath the central brooch, well, the central gold image with a large pearl. He tends to slightly exaggerate a kind of cast shadow underneath things in order to make them really kind of stand out vividly. And I think that he does that. I think that's something that he adds into representations afterwards, rather than he's looking at exactly how shadows work, because he knows that visually it gives you that sense of a kind of powerful standing out then in 3 dimensions. And it's something that he applies to objects kind of all throughout his work, these kind of exaggerated shadows that if you're not really kind of paying attention to them, you'll just kind of think, oh yes, this is completely naturalistic. But when you start to look at them, you realize that they're in some cases rather false. And there's a lot of really exaggerated shadows in this particular painting as well.